Happy Easter, everyone. Today is the final part of our teaching series, God of the Cross, where we've been looking at some of the things that Jesus reveals about God at the cross. It's been quite a short series, this one, only 4 weeks, and if you've missed any of the talks, they're all available on this channel. So far, we've looked at how the cross reveals a God who is prepared to suffer both with us and for us, a God who meets us in our pain. We've looked at how Jesus reveals a God who is willing to carry our burdens and willing to be obedient to death, even death on a cross. And on Good Friday, we looked at how Jesus reveals a God who is forgiving, a God who turns the other cheek and goes the second mile for us. And today, because it's Easter Sunday, I thought it would be good for us to explore how Jesus reveals a God who resurrects. I am so grateful that we have a God who resurrects. And that can mean different things at different points in our life, can't it? For those that are struggling with mental health or physical health, for example, it might mean feeling normal, it might be a return to being healthy. For those who have lost jobs or other securities, it might be entering into a new chapter or finding a new passion. For those whose faith has perhaps taken a hit, it might mean returning to something meaningful, discovering a new path or a new way. And for those of us who have lost someone that we love, it might mean the hope that we will see them again. The story of the prodigal son that Jesus told, it's the father who experienced resurrection as his son returns home. He said, "This son of mine was dead, but has now returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found." And the son too experienced resurrection in the father's embrace. As he approached his home, he no longer felt worthy to be called a son, but the father kissed him and gave him back all that he had lost. The woman who had been bleeding for 12 years experienced resurrection when she touched the hem of Jesus' garment and was healed. Jesus called her daughter and gave her back her life. Zacchaeus experienced resurrection when he stopped cheating people out of their money and gave half his possessions to the poor. Jesus said, "Today, salvation has come to this house." The widow of Nain experienced resurrection when Jesus noticed her with the mourning crowd, saw her tears and gave her back her son. And of course, he did the same thing for Mary and Martha with their brother Lazarus. He said to them, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live even though they die." Jesus' life and his ministry are chock full of stories of resurrection, but of course, the greatest resurrection took place on Easter morning, when after 3 days in the grave, Jesus rose again. And so today I want to explore the resurrection from the perspective of some of those who were there, some of Jesus' closest followers, family and friends. There's 3 people that I want to look at with you, and each instance, I'm going to suggest what resurrection may have meant to them and indeed what it might mean for us today. And we're going to start with one of Jesus' closest friends. And perhaps rather surprisingly, she was not one of the disciples, or at least not one of the 12 that was spoken about most often. Her name was Mary, or sometimes Magdalene, because she was from the region of Magdala on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Now, it's not clear from the Gospels how she came to first meet Jesus. Unfortunately, the Gospel writers are not always great at recording details about the women who followed Jesus. Many of them aren't even given a name. But Mary from Magdala was, which is something that should inform us of her significance. There's been much speculation over the years as to the exact nature of a relationship with Jesus, some even suggesting they were married, although there's no real evidence of this in the gospel accounts. Actually, we're only really told 2 things about her. Firstly, that she was wealthy, Luke lists her among a group of women who travelled with and supported Jesus out of their own means in chapter 8 of his gospel. And secondly, that Jesus had helped her with 7 demons. Now, if ever there was a biblical story that needed a bit more detail, surely this was it. But unfortunately, we're not given it. We don't know if Jesus helped her get free all at once, or if this was something that happened gradually over time, perhaps on 7 different occasions. We don't even know how these demons presented themselves. In the first century, many physiological and psychological illnesses were attributed to demonic forces. So this could have easily been perhaps a healing, or maybe several healings. But one thing I think we can conclude is that Mary from Magdala had suffered a great deal in her life. In fact, in Jewish writing, the number 7 is often used to suggest completeness. And so it's possible that what's being suggested here is that her life had been completely overtaken by whatever this ailment was. And her wealth and her status had done nothing to save her from this condition. But in Jesus, she found hope and she found healing. In Jesus, she found rescue. And perhaps most importantly, she found someone who was worth following, someone to call a friend. Whilst nearly all of the disciples abandoned Jesus at the cross, Mary remained. She stood with his mother and another woman who was also called Mary, and she watched. She watched as the one person who'd been able to bring her back to life lost his own. What a heartbreaking moment that must have been for her. But the Jesus that she had pursued with her whole life wasn't about to let her down. This is what we read in John 20. It says, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. And the first thing she does when she sees this empty tomb is she races to tell Simon and John. And she says to them, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they've put him. Peter and John, being typically male, make no attempt whatsoever to console Mary and instead run off to look for themselves. And once they confirm it with their own eyes, that's when they believe her. But Mary, who had presumably followed them back, stood outside the tomb crying. It says, as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw 2 angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They've taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they've put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. But she did not realize it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go and get him." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." Nothing more, just her name. Presumably, he'd said it 100 times before, but it was enough for her to recognize him. She turned around and cried in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And Jesus said, "Don't hold on to me or cling to me, for I've not yet ascended to the Father. Instead, go to my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and to your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And it was this act of witness that earned her the nickname, the Apostle to the Apostles. She was the first person to not only see Jesus, but to believe in his resurrection. She was honored by Jesus for her faithfulness and her love. The resurrection reminds us that faith in Jesus is never misplaced. Even when we face situations where it seems that all hope is gone, Jesus still has the final word and is looking to honor those who choose to follow him with their whole lives. I don't know, maybe you're somebody who doesn't feel particularly honored right now. Perhaps you feel as though you're always overlooked, that you're invisible, that your struggles, they go unnoticed. You know, in the first century, the witness of women was considered untrustworthy. That's why Peter and John run off to look for themselves. But Jesus chose to appear to Mary first. Despite her being overlooked by the gospel writers and many others, he chose her. He met her in her distress all those years ago, and he set her free, and then he never let her down. The resurrection reminds us that Jesus sees us in our distress, that he desires to set us free. It shows us just how far Jesus is prepared to go for us to understand, to know how important we are to him. You are not overlooked or forgotten about. You are chosen and loved by the creator of the universe. And in Jesus, you have somebody who is worth pursuing with your whole life. That's Mary. The second person I want to talk about today is actually the first person that Mary ran to, one of Jesus' closest followers, Simon, later nicknamed Peter or the Rock by Jesus. Simon was given the nickname the Rock because he understood who Jesus was. Now, arguably, he was the swottiest of all disciples. He was always the first to speak up, always keen to get himself involved and do what Jesus asked him to do. You know, when they first met, Jesus said, "Let down the nets." And even though he'd caught nothing all night, he did as he was told and had his best haul ever. When Jesus beckoned him out onto the water in the middle of the storm again, he did it, and he stood with Jesus, his master, on the water, at least for a few seconds. When Jesus took Simon up the mountain to witness him talking with Moses and Elijah, it was Simon who offered to put up these tents of meeting for them. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus was betrayed and arrested, it was Simon who drew his sword to defend his master, cutting off the ear of one of the servants. But here Jesus stopped him. Jesus actually rebuked him, and he healed the servant that Simon had hurt. And to Simon's horror, he allowed himself to be arrested, to be taken by those he had preached so fervently against. And I think in this moment, something happened to Simon's faith, because a short time later, he found himself in a courtyard being identified as a follower of Jesus. And rather than holding his head up and proudly proclaiming, "Yes, it's me, I'm a follower of Jesus," he denied it. He denied even knowing him 3 times, even though Jesus had warned him he would do this. It still hurt. And after that, Simon just kind of disappeared. Unlike Mary, he was nowhere to be seen at the cross. I wonder what Jesus might have said to him had he been there. But Simon had allowed his fear and his despair to take over completely. We find out later that he and the rest of the disciples had went and locked themselves in a room for fear that they too might be arrested. They went into hiding. It says in John 20, verse 19. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side, and the disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. But I think Simon's moment of resurrection came a little while later, when they were once again fishing on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus came and once again told them where to fish. Simon, at that moment, jumped into the water and swam to the shore to meet him. And then they had breakfast together. I love that. I love how normal that is. They probably had breakfast 100 times before, but I bet this breakfast hit a little different. And after breakfast, Jesus sits and he speaks with Simon. And for every denial, he offers him the chance to start again. He says, do you love me? And Simon says, yes, you know that I do. And then he says, feed my sheep. He healed his faith. He restored his trust. He gave him back his purpose. You know, there's times when we all lose our faith or stop trusting in Jesus, isn't there? Even those of us who have perhaps in the past been the swottiest Christians of all, those who have committed their lives to him, have tried to do everything he asked of us. But for some reason or another, our faith and our trust in Jesus just went away. Perhaps, like Simon, things didn't work out the way we were expecting. Or perhaps our fears over what others might think or say or do to us took over and we went into hiding perhaps even from ourselves. But the resurrection reminds us that with Jesus, there is always the opportunity to start again, to come back to him and find healing and purpose. Indeed, the resurrection teaches us that sometimes death is needed in order for new life to spring up. Sometimes the faith of our youth is simply not big enough to handle all that life has thrown at us. But Jesus is. And he's always waiting for us on the shore, ready to eat breakfast and talk with us about what might be next. For Peter, resurrection meant that he hadn't missed it. He could start again with Jesus. And so can you. The final person I want to look at today was closer than a friend or a follower, because they were a member of Jesus' own family. Jesus was born as a human and had an earthly mother and father, Mary and Joseph. He also had 4 brothers, James, Jude, Joseph, and Simon, not to be confused with Simon Peter, as well as some unnamed sisters, of course. During his earthly ministry, Jesus' siblings were not all that keen on him. John 7:5 tells us they didn't believe the things that he claimed about himself. You know, you would think having a brother that can turn water into wine would be a good thing. But anyway, later on, after the resurrection, they did come to believe. We're told in Acts 1:14 that they actually joined together with the apostles and the women in prayer. But it's Jesus' mother that I want to focus on for a few minutes, because I think she had a really tough time of it. Actually, there's a Catholic tradition that states that Jesus' mother experienced 7 sorrows throughout her life. The first was the prophecy in Luke chapter 2, where Simeon says, a sword will pierce your own soul. I wonder how many times she agonized over those words. The second sorrow is when they were forced to escape to Egypt to avoid Herod's murderous rampage, becoming refugees in a foreign land. The third was when she lost Jesus returning from that festival and had to frantically set about searching for him. I can kind of relate to that one because I've lost my son once at a play park, and it was the longest, most terrifying 10 minutes of my life as I searched for him. And the last 4 sorrows all take place at Calvary, as she witnessed Jesus carrying his cross naked and ashamed, as she watched him slowly suffocate and die, as she saw him taken down from the cross and eventually laid to rest in that cold, dark tomb. How sorrowful that day must have been for her. I've got to be honest though, I'm not sure 7 sorrows is enough. I actually think Mary must have constantly struggled over Jesus' life and ministry. There's this moment in Mark chapter 3 where she's really worried about him because he's not having the opportunity to eat properly. How mother-like is that? And so she takes her other sons with her to collect him, but he refuses to come with them. He says, "Who are my mother and brothers?" I'm sure that must have stung. But I bet she continued to worry every time Jesus was swarmed by the crowds, every time he was challenged, every time he had abuse thrown at him, every time he failed to look after himself properly because he was too busy taking care of others. That time he thought it was a good idea to go wild camping in the desert for 40 days without any supplies, or that time he decided to take a stroll on a lake in the middle of a storm without a raincoat. I imagine she wasn't best pleased when she heard about that. He did what? But Mary carried the burden of being Jesus' mother for over 30 years, constantly worrying about her son, because that's what being a parent is like. And of course, at the cross, her worst fears were realized. I imagine her whole world collapsed at that moment. But at the resurrection, Jesus brings her peace. He shows her that all of her fears and worries can finally be laid to rest, that her son is indeed alive and will be forevermore. And the resurrection, it offers us the same assurance, because we all carry the weight of others with us, don't we? Our children, our family, our friends. And many of us have lost people who we dearly, dearly love. But the resurrection reminds us that we can trust Jesus with those that we have lost. That whatever sorrows we face in this life, our future is secure. As the Apostle Paul attests, I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all of creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. At the resurrection, Jesus reminds us that that sword that pierced Mary's soul can be removed, that she can be free from all of her fears about tomorrow, and that we can experience that same peace, that same release. So whether you're like Mary of Magdala, who was faithful to Jesus her entire life, or Simon, whose faith took a hit, or Jesus' mother, who faced many sorrows, the resurrection, I believe, has something for you today. At the resurrection, Jesus reveals a God who never lets us down. A God who is waiting to give us another chance, to let us start again anew. A God who brings us peace and hope and assurance in the most difficult and tragic of times. This is the God of resurrection, and this is the God that we celebrate today on Easter Sunday. Happy Easter.